Is imagination simply contained in the mind, or does it tap into an unseen world with messages waiting to be told? There is a place where legends cross over into our world, where strange visions and whispers beckon, and superstition takes hold. Step into the Black Cat's shadow with Andy Usry.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the Black Cat Shadow. This is episode number 5, and I am your host Andy, podcasting from Kansas City, Missouri. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about Zombie from 1979. It's a classic Italian zombie movie. Has so many great scenes that if you haven't seen it, you just need to see it. I will say that there is a scene where a zombie fights a shark. It's a classic horror movie scene. You need to see the movie just for that scene. And so some of the things I've been doing here lately, there's a cool new stream. Well, it's not new, but there's a website, the Full Moon Film Company, Charles Band. They have a streaming service now, and they have a really good deal going on right now. If you subscribe to a year, sign up for a year, I think it's $65 for a year. And if you sign up for a year, you get 6 free Blu-rays or DVDs. You also get a $50 credit to their online store. So I think that's a pretty good deal. So I went ahead and signed up for it. They have some pretty cheesy movies, but they have the Puppet Master movies. They have Trancers. They have lots of different movies. They also have the Blue Underground. A lot of those movies. They have the Wizard Video Collection. So they have some really older classic movies too, that I'm definitely looking forward to checking out. If you're a fan of B movies or just older classic horror movies, I'd say check it out, definitely. And it's a great deal. I mean, I think the DVDs, the Blu-rays that you get, and the credit for the store, that more than pays for your streaming service. So I'd say go check it out. It's at fullmoonstreaming.com. I'm looking forward to watching some movies. I've been watching through the Twilight Zone, the original series. I'm really liking those black and white episodes. Those are fun. Back from vacation, back off the 4th of July weekend, and ready to talk about some horror movies. Let's dive right into Zombie from 1979.
It is midnight on a tropical island. A beautiful young girl's long hair streams against the coral reef. Her beautiful body is caressed by the tide. Suddenly, a decayed hand rises up and blood-drenched jaws move to bite her. The living dead walk again. Zombie. They are decaying. They are missing from their graves. They live and hunger for your flesh. There is no place you can hide. Zombie. You are what they eat. No one under 17 will be admitted. Zombie.
Okay, Zombie was released at July 18th, 1980. So I guess they have the release date as 1979, but I think the American release was in 1980. The original title for this movie was called Zombie 2, and I think they were going for a sequel to Dawn of the Dead. They were trying to cash in on that franchise. And some of the taglines for that movie are, when the earth spits out the dead, they will rise to suck the blood of the living. And if you love Dawn of the Dead, you'll just eat up Zombie. We are going to eat you. The dead are among us. They will rise to suck the blood of the living. When the earth spits out the dead, they will return to tear the flesh of the living. That was the tagline of the UK video release. So I was looking at this there's actually kind of a zombie franchise, if you want to call it that. I was kind of looking at all the movies that are called Zombie that have been released with that name. And funny enough, the next movie chronologically that was released was a movie called Killing Birds. And here, not too long ago, it was re-released by Shriek Show. It's a label that distributes movies, horror movies mainly. They named it Zombie 5. They wanted to cash in on the zombie franchise. But really, the zombies are only in the last few minutes of the movie. And there's only one character, and the movie's called Killing Birds, but there's only one character that's even attacked by birds. Let's see, and then there's Zombie 3. And then there's a movie called After Death, which is also known as Zombie 4. And then there's a zombie movie called Zombie They Live, which is in development. So I don't know anything about that one. So the director of Zombie is Lucio Fulci, which, if you're into Italian horror, you're going to recognize that name. He's directed The Beyond, The House by the Cemetery, The New York Ripper, and he even directed Zombie 3. The writer for this was Elisa Brigante. She wrote The House by the Cemetery and Hands of Steel, which is a really cheesy cyborg movie. I think it was released in 1986. I actually kind of liked it. I think it was supposed to be kind of a ripoff of Terminator. And then also another writer was Dardano Sacchetti, but he is actually uncredited because he didn't want to be connected to a zombie movie because his father passed away while they were working on it. He just didn't want to be associated with anything, I guess he thought it was taboo or something. But he also wrote The Cat o' Nine Tails, A Bay of Blood, The Beyond, The House by the Cemetery, The New York Ripper, Amityville 2, The Possession, Demons, Hands of Steel, and Demons 2. So he is neck deep in Italian horror. He's written quite a few of the well-known ones. And then the cast, I didn't really recognize too many people. I think a lot of these people have done more Italian movies, but the cast is Tisa Farrow. She plays Anne, the character of Anne, and she was also in Anthropophagus. It's a slasher movie, and it was really infamous because there was a really graphic scene where the killer was eating a fetus, and I think it's kind of hard to find that version of it where you actually see that scene. And then there's Ian McCulloch. He plays the character of Peter. He was in the movie called It, not the Stephen King adaptation, but there was a movie, I think it was in the 60s, with Roddy McDowall is his name, the character's name. He was in It, and he was like the main character in that movie. And it was about a golem or a statue that came to life. And then Ian McCulloch was also in Contamination, that was like a Italian version of Alien. It was kind of an Alien ripoff. It was pretty good though, pretty interesting movie. And then he was also in the Doctor Who TV series in the 80s. And then you have Richard Johnson, who played the character of Dr. Menard, and he was actually in The Haunting, the movie, the 1963 movie that I talked about the last episode. He was in a movie called The Comeback in 1978. Check that one out. He was also in Magnum P.I., some episodes of that. He was in Murder, She Wrote, and Tales from the Crypt. And he was also in Lara Croft, Tomb Raider. And so the plot of this movie, it's kind of a simple plot really, but it starts off with an abandoned yacht. It sails into New York, and the harbor police investigate. They see this sailboat that's just kind of floating. It looks abandoned, so they go to investigate. And lo and behold, there's a zombie aboard. So the police, they're attacked, and they shoot the zombie. One of them's actually killed. And so they find out that the boat belongs to a scientist, and they contact his daughter, but she actually hasn't talked to him for a few months. And she's really worried about her father, and so she teams up with a news reporter to travel to the island that her father went to, and they want to find out what's happened to him. So then it kind of jumps to on the island. We meet Dr. Menard and his wife, and Dr. Menard is studying patients with an illness that has broken out on the island, and he thinks that voodoo may be involved, and then craziness ensues. So it goes on from there. This is a really good zombie movie. I highly recommend it. I actually had not seen it until I watched it for this episode. So I'm really surprised that I don't know, for whatever reason, I just have never watched it up to this point. But I'm really glad that I did. So in this movie, Lucio Fulci wanted to get back to like the voodoo zombies, I think, that had been portrayed in earlier movies. You know, after Night of the Living Dead, they were more of an unexplained phenomenon. So you know, in this movie, they were the slower moving zombies. They weren't fast zombies by any means. And it seemed like you know, the victims, the people that were made into zombies, it seemed like there was like a sickness or an illness, but it also seemed like the doctor was thinking there was voodoo involved. So, but they didn't really explain like how it all kind of tied together. But you always heard like the voodoo drums in the distance and stuff, so you always knew like that. Always, like, I guess, kept it in the back of your mind that there was some kind of voodoo involved. And so like I said, like, he just was trying to treat these patients and figure out the cause of their sickness. And you know, and the sickness, they just kind of like a green stuff growing on their face and stuff, and they would just be sick and then die. And then of course they would rise up as zombies after they died. That's how they're portrayed in the movie. And so there are some differences in how they show up in folklore. But you know, in this movie, the people that are bitten do turn into zombies, so it follows that zombie mythology, you know, as far as the zombies, how they are in the movie. But it also had like people that had already been buried for some time being resurrected as zombies too. It wasn't just the people that got sick that got turned into zombies. So that was interesting. So yeah, they didn't really explain how the people were being turned into zombies, but it was an interesting premise. I thought that was interesting, you know, how the zombies got introduced to New York, you know, because at the beginning with the boat, and there was a zombie on board, and it bit one of the police officers, and then he was taken to the morgue where, you know, it kind of shows him coming back to life. And then, you know, at the end of the movie, you see basically a zombie outbreak happening all over. You see the zombies descending on New York. So in that regard, it is like more like the traditional Night of the Living Dead zombies, where there's just kind of a mysterious outbreak. But then also there's also an underlying voodoo tie into it somehow, but they don't really explain it. But it's interesting, and there are a lot of really gruesome death scenes in this movie. Especially there's a really brutal eye gouge, and I think from what I've heard, Lucio Fulci is kind of popular for doing eye gouges. And also the zombie versus the shark scene. And the reason why it kind of like this whole battle happened was because there was a woman scuba diving, and so the zombie, somehow there was a zombie in the ocean just walking around, I guess, and it wanted to, you know, catch this woman and eat her. But then there was also a shark there that wanted to eat the woman too. And so like it was like the zombie and the shark were just like fighting over the woman, you know, but she actually escaped while they were fighting. But it was an interesting scene because, you know, being underwater, you know, the zombie makeup had to hold up and stuff. I thought it held up really well for being underwater. And I can't remember, I think the zombie actually bit the shark. So now there's probably, you know, in this story there would be like a zombie shark swimming around somewhere. And that would be really scary too. I think they actually made a movie. I'm sure Sci-Fi's done a zombie shark movie at some point. But yeah, I thought this was an interesting zombie movie. You know, the zombies are portrayed, you know, kind of how they have been, and nothing really new in that, but they did try to tie in voodoo with it, so I thought that was an interesting touch.
The living dead.
So I wanted to get into the zombie mythology after watching this movie and find out more about the voodoo traditions and the zombie folklore, and how zombies appear in the folklore as opposed to how they appear in movies. I'm going to look at how are zombies created in these traditions and how are they stopped, is there a cure, and also have there been any cases of real life zombies. So starting off, voodoo was brought to the US and Haiti from West Africa by enslaved Africans. In voodoo lore, there are powers that they believe that there's powers that can inhabit a dead body and reanimate it. So there are three major voodoo practitioners that are believed to have brought zombification to America. There's Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, which is Marie Laveau. There's her mentor and teacher, Dr. John. And then there's, in Texas, there's actually a voodoo queen called Black Cat Mama Couteau, I think that's how you pronounce it. In the folklore, a zombie is a dead human body reanimated. It's created by a bakor, or a voodoo sorcerer, or a bad voodoo practitioner. Mainly, the types of voodoo practitioners that would create a zombie are not really people looking out for the well-being of others. It's kind of like people that have kind of went to the dark side of voodoo. So these zombies are created as a slave to these sorcerers, and so that's kind of the main difference between the movie zombie and the traditional zombie, because in the movies, zombies are just created accidentally and they're just mindless monsters that go around eating people, but in voodoo they're actually created for a purpose. They're created to serve the sorcerer that created them. During the U.S. occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934, the cases of zombies began to be reported. And then, with the spread of voodoo in the southern U.S., introduced many to the zombie lore here. So there's actually a few different types of zombies in the lore. There's undead. There's people that have died by violence. So a woman that died a virgin her spirit was actually a type of zombie. And then there's also a spirit zombie there's like a zombie that doesn't have a body. It's called a zombie astral. And actually the sorcerers will try to capture these spirits to gain more power. The souls are sealed in special bottles and they're sold as charms for luck, healing, or business success. So that is what zombies are according to folklore. And so for the question of how are zombies created, the rituals to make a zombie, there's kind of different rituals, but the main thing in movies where zombies bite somebody and they become a zombie, well, that's not really that doesn't really follow the traditions. Basically they're just created by the sorcerer, the evil voodoo practitioner. There's the rituals kind of consist of just them digging up a fresh corpse, feeding them some potion, and whispering, a chant to the body. Some believe that these potions are strong enough that the zombies will never die, and they'll be immortal, basically. And even some voodoo masters, they were believed to have zombified themselves, so they would live forever. So, I found a recipe for zombie powder, but, it's just the powder. I guess, according to the traditions, there's actually some chants or prayers or things that they have to say to actually make this work, so I don't think that this by itself would work, but it's interesting to see the actual recipe. But it calls for 1 human skull, assorted bones from a water rat, a pure white cat, an iguana tail, the teeth of a man 19 years dead, a good dose of pure vegetable oil, a dash or 2 of datura, and I'll talk about what that is here in a minute, 2 blue agama lizards of the male sex, 1 big toad called Crapaudbonga, I don't even know how you pronounce that, but the toad must weigh 1 pound, 1 sea snake's brain and sex organ, several pods of itching pea, 2 preferably female pufferfish, and then you can add tarantulas, millipedes, and white tree frogs to taste. But it says the potion should be prepared in June, when the female pufferfish contains its greatest quantities of Tetrodotoxin. It says be careful not to touch the mixture at any time as it can act through skin. Then you want to tie the snake to the toad's leg, put them in a jar and bury it. This is so that the toad dies of rage, which increases the concentration of its poison. Then you place its skull in a fire with thunderstone and some blessed oil and burn till black. Then you roast the animal ingredients and grind with the uncooked plants and a pestle and mortar. Then you add unheated shavings of the bones. And then there's a few sacred spells, and grind up your mixture into a fine powder. Place in a jar and bury in the coffin with the rest of your source skeleton, if possible, for 3 days. And this potion is called a coupe poudre. That's what they call this. That's like the Creole name for it. So, you know, in the ingredients, they vary. Ingredients and spells vary between different people. You know, I guess, you know, from what I've read. But there's a couple of chemicals that they feel like are really the active toxins that kind of create the mindset for the zombie. So there's the toxin Tetrodotoxin that I named earlier. That comes from the pufferfish, and what that does is that puts the victim in suspended animation, and so their breathing is very subdued and not even noticeable to observers. Their heart rate is near zero, but the person is conscious, but they're just unable to speak. So then they are believed to be dead, and they're buried. You know, then the evil sorcerer, you know, the Bokor, digs up the body. He gives his victim a second drug, which is kind of like a psychedelic or psychoactive. It's derived from Jimson weed. It's called Datura, and this causes delirium and disorientation. And you know, the victim, they can't function normally. They're easily controllable. And there have been some cases of family members that they thought were dead. They were found years later alive, and they said they had been zombified and used as slave labor. So that's pretty freaky to think of somebody being drugged and buried alive and then dug up only to be made as a slave to work for somebody, you know, taken from your family. That's crazy to think about that could actually happen. And I don't know if it still happens or not, but that's pretty scary. And it's rumored that each of the cemeteries of New Orleans has what they call a devil's chair among the gravestones. And you know, and in St. Louis Cemetery number 1, there's what's called a devil's throne, and that it's actually like a zombie making chair. So like the legend goes, if you sit on it on a dark moonless night and you ask the devil to transform you into a living zombie, you'll be immortal. But I think, you know, the downside of that, you know, when he deals with the devil, you're probably gonna end up giving him your soul, you know. So it's not much of a bargain, but you know, whatever. So in Haiti, it's actually kind of common practice for people to be buried face down when they're buried, so the corpse cannot hear the sorcerer summoning them. Or they may also be buried with a weapon. So if they are, if they do find themselves in this situation, you know, they can fight off the sorcerer with their weapon. So as far as like one way to protect you or stop a zombie in this lore, one way to protect is to feed it salt. But in moderation, the salt can just freeze the zombie. But I guess the zombies can't cross over like a salt line. If you put like a line of salt on the ground, they can't cross over it. And there's another thing called zombie stay-away powder, and it's made with something called chayote root. And I guess that's supposed to freeze zombies in their tracks. They can't cross over it. And also, if they're fed it, they will return to normal for like 9 days. But then after that, they'll go back to being a zombie, I guess. So I'm not really sure what the cure would be for that, for a zombie. I guess just wait till the drugs wear off. Unless there actually is something supernatural involved, which, who knows. There's another freaky legend about these voodoo midwives. They did these spells to create zombie children that don't age and they stay kids, or some kind of, they're supposed to be some of the most dangerous zombies. And Marie Laveau, which was the queen of New Orleans voodoo, she was rumored to be a zombie child. There's also a legend of witches' trains. It's folklore from southern Africa They're also known as zombie trains. As the story goes, if there's a person wandering alone at night, they may encounter a train, and sometimes, it's even on a, used track, and sometimes it's also just simply moving along the landscape as if on a track, but there is no track there, and this train will stop for the person. And if if the person just gets on the train, there's a conductor there, and they'll ask whether they're seeking a single trip, a one-way, or a return trip. So if you answer a single trip, then that results in the person being killed and resurrected as a zombie to spend their life doing the bidding of a witch or sorcerer. And those who respond return, or a two-way trip, will find themselves beaten and then thrown from the train several miles away from where they were picked up. So in Europe, in the Middle Ages, it was commonly believed that the souls of the dead could return to Earth and haunt the living. The belief in revenants, someone who has returned from the dead, are well documented by contemporary European writers of the time. According to the Encyclopedia of Things That Never Were, the revenant rises from the dead. Particularly in France during the Middle Ages, this was a common belief. So the revenant rises from the dead, usually to avenge some crime committed against the entity, most likely a murder. The revenant usually took on a form of an emaciated corpse or skeletal human figure and wandered around graveyards at night. And all through Europe and Asia, there are stories of creatures that resemble zombies. There's the Strigoi in Romania. There's something called the Bake Kujira, which is literally translated to ghost whale, is a skeletal whale wandering the seas of Japan, and it brings bad luck to anyone who dares to sail on its seas. In the nature kingdom, there's some freaky stuff that's almost like zombies. That's really is like zombies. So there's a fungus, and when its spore meets an ant, the spore actually enters the ant's body through holes in its exoskeleton. The fungus then starts to grow inside the ant's body, and while it's growing, it's absorbing soft tissue, but it still leaves the vital organs intact. And because the ant has to still be alive and fully functional for a while, to be of use to the fungus. And then whenever this fungus when it kind of reaches maturity and is ready to multiply, it grows these filaments that grow into the ant's brain, and then the fungus, it produces chemicals that they poison the ant's brain and cause it to become transportation to the fungus. Takes it to its to the place where it can spread around. The ant, it's no longer in control of its own body. It leaves its colony, and it climbs up a plant, and it clamps its jaw around a leaf at the top and fastens to it. And there, the fungus just comes out of the ant's head. I think the ant's head just splits open, and then the spores just go out into the air from there, and they just keep spreading. The spores, they fly through the air and they land on other ants, and they just continue this life cycle of this fungus. And the whole infection, from beginning to end, can take as little as 2 weeks. So the next example is a parasitic wasp, and it actually preys on spiders. It turns the spider into a slave and a meal, and the spider's web into a safe haven for its young larvae. So the female wasp, it will paralyze the spider with the sting and the later eggs on its abdomen. And then when the egg hatches, the larva lives on the spider and sucks blood out of the spider to eat for nourishment. And then a few weeks later, the larva, it's ready to move on to the next stage of its life cycle, and it injects the spider with a chemical that alters its behavior. So the next time the zombies, so now that it's like a zombie spider, so the next time it builds a web, it keeps repeating the first few steps over and over again. Instead of going through all the regular steps of building a web, it just does the first few little strands over and over again, and it basically results So it's like a cocoon, and the spider crawls to the center of the web and just sits there. The larva molts, kills the spider, and then it eats any remaining stuff out of the spider, and then it builds its cocoon on the spider web, and then a few weeks later the adult wasp emerges and it starts all over again. Let's see, and then the next one, it's the emerald cockroach wasp, and as their name suggests, these wasps use cockroaches as living nurseries for their eggs. So when a female wasp is ready to lay her eggs, she comes in and lands on the roach's back and puts her stinger into its midsection, and the roach's legs buckle, and then it kind of falls over and is paralyzed. And this buys the wasp time to do some brain surgery on the cockroach. She puts her stinger through the roach's head and into its brain, and she kind of like probes around until she hits the right spot. Then she releases some venom, but it doesn't paralyze the roach. The roach can still move its legs, but it can't move on its own. And so the wasp, it grabs this cockroach's antenna and starts moving it like its own little chariot or something. Anyway, so she leads the roach to the burrow, where she lays her eggs on its abdomen and then leaves. And then all the roach can do is sit and wait, and then the egg hatches and the larva comes out, and then it basically eats the roach's abdomen and wriggles. It goes inside and lives for a week, and it keeps eating on the roach's organs the whole time. I guess it forms like a cocoon, and then it comes out as a full-grown adult a few weeks later, basically just using the roach as kind of like a makeshift cocoon. And then there's another wasp. There's a lot of wasps that do this. It's weird. Females of this species, they lay a bunch of eggs inside caterpillars, and the larvae come out a little bit later and they start spinning their cocoons. And it seems like in this instance, it seems like the host gets off pretty easy, but there's a few of the larvae actually stay inside the caterpillar, but they kind of give their life for their siblings in a way, because they stay inside the caterpillar. They take control of the caterpillar's body and force it to stand guard over the cocoons of its fellow larvae. And so the caterpillar just waits motionless, and whenever a predator comes too close, it thrashes about, it lashes out violently at the predator to drive it away. So then, whenever the adult wasps come out of the cocoon, and the caterpillar actually just dies from starvation because it can't move. These larvae inside it just control it the whole time. This last nature zombie, I was surprised to find so many bugs that do this kind of thing, but there's this parasitic hairworm, and it grows up inside a grasshopper or a cricket, but it spends its life as an adult in water. But to make the transition to water, it forces its host to go for a swim, basically, so it can get into the water. So it injects the insect full of proteins, which kind of like are chemicals that the bug actually produces on its own, but it sabotages the nervous system, and it compels the bug to jump into the nearest body of water. And of course the bug drowns, and the adult hairworm comes out of the bug, and it swims away, and it starts all over again. So the bugs get infected when they're drinking water with these little babies, these worms in it. So I wanted to see if there was any real life cases of zombies, or any cases where there was, any experiments that people try to create zombies, or anything, any weird scientific experiments, kind of like Frankenstein. And I actually found some stuff with the Nazis. They had a lot of experiments where they were trying to reanimate dead bodies. In some cases they used electrical charges, like in Frankenstein, with electrical stimulation to reanimate bodies. And some of the soldiers that came back from the war, there was stories, that they said that these German soldiers that were they got shot, but they kept marching after they were hit by gunfire. And they said that some were said to have gaping wounds, and they really looked like they had been dead for a few days and smelled bad. Like German soldiers that had just been killed. Like some of the soldiers that were walking around thought they smelled like they'd been dead for a few days. Actually, it was also believed that doctors in the concentration camps, they were under orders to do experiments on reviving the dead to learn how to make Germans a superior race. Hitler, he wanted ultimate power. He was very interested in the occult, and he also wanted a way to control people that might oppose him politically. So he was trying to figure out ways to subdue people mentally. They figured that it would be easier to just mentally control people rather than fight wars and kill off more and more Germans. This way it would save German lives if they just resorted to mind control things. So they heard about the experiments that they did in England, and they found that the low doses of fluoride actually make subjects more docile, easier to control. So in the Nazi prison camps, they took some of the more unruly prisoners or inmates, experimented on them with fluoride, and they were actually successful in making them more manageable. And so, the Nazis, they had this scheme. They thought that they would control the world with fluoride medicated water supplies, and they would make zombie armies out of their subjects. People that would just fight for them, no questions asked, and be very controllable. And they wouldn't have to use Germans in the army. They could spare German lives. But the German people themselves were also subjected to these fluoride experiments. And, it's thought that maybe this is one reason why there was such a fanatical worship of Hitler, why he had such a rise to power like he did. And there is a movie from 1988, Wes Craven did. It's called Serpent and the Rainbow, and it's actually kind of about a real-life case of a reported zombie. It's a really interesting case. The movie's really good. I suggest you check it out. There's a man called Clairvius Narcisse, and he is like one of, I don't know if he's the only documented case, but he's one of the probably the more popular documented cases of a quote-unquote zombie. So this guy, when he was like 40, and he was sick, so he went to the hospital. He had a fever. He felt like something like bugs were crawling on his skin. So, the doctors they thought that he really looked sick, so they put him in a room, and then just a few days later he was pronounced dead. And there was actually an official death certificate, and he actually was in the morgue for 24 hours. They bury their dead in 24 hours because they don't do embalming. They don't have the embalming process there, or at this time they didn't. So that's why a lot of people were actually buried alive, because they don't embalm, or they didn't embalm the dead bodies. So that's kind of how this was more likely to happen in Haiti rather than nowadays, because now they embalm a person. So if they for some reason are drugged and are not dead, they would be dead after they were embalmed. So the family of Clairvius, they buried him. Then I guess supposedly, they got this story from Clairvius. So they found him later on. But so this is kind of his story they told. So Clairvius was dug up by the sorcerer. And then he said they beat him up and they bound him and gave him a strange potion, which is probably the second part of the potion that makes him psychotic and not able to be mentally functional. And then they took Narcisse to a sugar plantation where there was actually other zombie slaves there too working, and they put Narcisse to work. And they were continually injecting him with doses of the potion to maintain his zombie-like mindset. But then the sorcerer died 2 years later, and so Narcisse escaped, and he was able to be free. And but he actually didn't make it back home until 16 years later, and he finally returned, found his family, and then told them about all this, what happened to him. But yeah, it's a really strange case. That is probably one of the more popular cases, a real life zombie, as close as you're going to get to the zombie of the voodoo tradition. And some people think too that some of these effects of these drugs are more maybe like a placebo effect. You know, the reason why they act like zombies, like the traditional zombies, they have these cultural beliefs where they, you know, where they think, you know, where they know about what zombies are supposed to act like, so that's what influences their behavior. So, you know, could this have been the power of suggestion, or, you know, could this be the effect of drugs? You know, it's an interesting thing to look at, and also just the idea of zombies are very interesting. The whole idea of voodoo is very interesting. So I hope that you found this informative and interesting. You can check me out on social media. I am on Twitter at Black Cat Podcast. You can check me out on there. I usually tweet out some horror news headlines, anything else that looks interesting to me. I'm also on Facebook. I am on Horror Amino as well. And you can also email me at blackcatpodcast@gmail.com. And so that'll wrap it up for episode 5, this Mythos Macabre episode where I looked at the movie Zombie from 1979 from director Lucio Fulci. And again, if you have not seen that, I would highly recommend it. It is a great zombie movie, very creepy. So guys, remember to take a closer look at the world around you, and you might just find it as stranger and more mysterious than you thought, especially in the Black Cat Shadow.